We are here at the State Fair. It is August 28th, and this is a special. So I just want to note at the top, I'm your host, Eric Roper, and today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. So this is an extra special episode of Curious Minnesota. First of all, we're at the State Fair, which I already noted. Anybody in the crowd, let them know you're out there. I love that. I wasn't sure if that was going to work. Thank you all so much for saying a little noise. Okay, so the second reason that today's episode is special is that we're actually talking about the origins of this institution. I'm pointing at the building here, the Minnesota Star Tribune. And I'll be honest, I've worked here for 15 years, and I did not know most of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Did you?
I did not. It's fascinating.
Erica Pearson here was the reporter who wrote this story. And she's also part of Curious Minnesota team.
Yes.
So, so that's why I'm going to be asking Erica questions, because it was, hold up the story there. This was in the paper this Sunday. There it is. And there's a great picture there of our, we're going to get to that, but that's how, when we were part of City Hall, the Tribune and City Hall were together. But I'm skipping ahead. Okay, so the question that was, so Curious Minnesota is all about reader questions. And the question that was asked here was essentially, how did the Minnesota Star Tribune get its start? And this was asked by Curious Minnesota superfan Sharon Carlson. So there's actually three histories we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the history of the Tribune, the history of the Minneapolis Journal, if anybody remembers the Minneapolis Journal, and then the Minnesota Star, the Minneapolis Star in 1920. So let's just sort of launch right into it. And chronology is our friend. And we should note that we're not talking about the whole history of the papers, although we sort of are, but we're going to focus on the early history. So, Erica, let's go back to the origins of the Tribune. 1867, the same year the city of Minneapolis is incorporated. What's going on in the city when the Tribune is started? Because we date back to the origins. We're 157 years old.
Yes. We're as old as the city of Minneapolis. And at that time, about 7,000 people lived in Minneapolis when the Tribune launched. The streets were unpaved. The sidewalks were wooden planks. And one of our former editors, named Bradley Morrison, wrote a book called Sunlight on Your Doorstep about our history, and he said there was no fire department, no sanitary system, no trained nurses, no city water supply, but there was a Minneapolis Tribune.
And so she mentioned Bradley Morrison. So Bradley Morrison is the great-grandson, is that right, or grandson?
Nephew.
Nephew.
Great nephew, yeah.
Of Doralus Morrison. Right? So, okay,
Indeed.
anyway, the point is, the Tribune is founded by some big deal people in this early city. Who are some of the people that helped found the Tribune?
Yes, so Minneapolis' first mayor, the same year, was just voted into office, and he was one of our founders. His name is Doralus Morrison. And the publisher, Colonel William King, was our first publisher, and he was famous for being anti-slavery, and he ran a weekly publication called The Atlas with some famous editorials there, and then he went on to be a U.S. representative.
And I live in the Kingfield neighborhood of Minneapolis, which is named after Colonel William King. So I both work for a newspaper he helped found, and I live in a neighborhood named after him. I feel like some sort of connection to this person,
Yes.
But anyway.
Yeah.
So these are sort of political, though. There's a political leaning to this paper.
Yes, you may be surprised to learn that the Tribune was founded as a Republican paper, promising to support the great cause of the Republican Party.
Okay. So you noted in the story that the first issue of the Tribune, 1867, began with an apology. So what's that all about?
Okay, so it was a 4-page issue, and there was an unfortunate incident the day before publishing, and they had to run way up top, above the fold, as we say, was an apology, and it said, "The lines being down most all day yesterday, we are without the greater part of our dispatches. No one can regret this accident more than ourselves." So, like I like to say, it was mostly all up from there.
So, yeah, like telegraphs are down. They're starting, it's an inauspicious start of the paper. So the Tribune, again, we noted, it's basically founded by some sort of, a lot of industrial, a lot of powerhouses in the city, because we're going to get later to some sort of the opposite of that with the Journal. But the Tribune then gets some pretty high-profile offices in 1873?
Yes, shared with City Hall.
Okay, so Bridge Square, Nicollet Avenue and Hennepin Avenue. If anyone, I don't know if anyone alive today, well, maybe they would have lived through Bridge Square, potentially, the later years. So, yeah, there was that building, the original City Hall. And if you look at the picture, so, yeah, there's basically City Hall, and it says, like, Tribune, like, basically all over the building. So we are very connected to that early history of Minneapolis. So how did, like, reporting work at that point? I mean, typewriters existed, but I don't think they were being used in newsrooms yet, at least in a big way.
No. It was, you were scribbling notes in your notepad, and then the folks in the print room were charged with deciphering handwriting and hand setting all of the articles for it to run through the press.
Got it. And we should give a plug. There's a great, venue here at the fair where you can watch how old printing presses worked, and you can see how they take the lead and make it into letters. And anyway, that could be relevant to any part of this conversation, but I'm just going to note it now.
Very cool.
Okay, so the Tribune is sort of chugging along. It's founded in 1867. By the 1870s, tell us about the Journal, because this sort of has a completely different founding story, or at least like sort of the background of who's behind it is a little less important or powerful or what have you.
Yeah, so the Journal sadly fell out of our name. So many people don't realize that one of the early main competitors of the Tribune, the Journal, was part of the Star Tribune's history. And they were founded in 1978 by 1878. Scrap that, by what the Pioneer Press at the time called a plucky trio of journalists. So it was not so much the mayors and industrials founding it. They each chipped in about $50 a piece to start the paper.
I love that. It's sort of like, it's very different from the Tribune founding, it feels, which is very sort of, like big business. This is like scrappy, sort of, they just want another evening paper in town. And I mean, okay. So I was going to note here, like, there's a quote, maybe you want to read it from, now in 1928, they were sort of recounting sort of how bare bones this initial operation was. I mean, maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the co-founders, his name was Frank Curtis, said that the material end of our enterprise was meager, some lead pencils and scratch paper. We owned no equipment. We had a few fonts of borrowed type and forms in a composing room.
I love this idea that they would own fonts. It's so cool and classic, right? Like, we can't imagine that today.
Yeah.
Okay, but this is not a sure thing at all.
No, and I had fun reading the very first issues of all of these papers, and in their first issue, they acknowledged in an editorial that they were coming along after 4 evening papers had recently started and failed.
Okay. And there was also some competition between the Tribune and the Journal. I just want to note, this is not a script, but these are notes, so we know we're hitting the right beats.
We're hitting our marks.
Yeah. But there's some competition between these two papers.
Yes, they were started with the idea of competition in mind, and one of their editorials in that very first issue noted some of that rivalry, saying, good competition is to the Tribune as water is to fire, and hence the Journal's appearance is anything but agreeable.
Because they had like the Tribune had sort of put a notice in that was a little snarky, or at least the Journal people interpreted it as being snarky. They were offended.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The Journal, also Republican.
Also Republican.
Okay, so we have 2 Republican papers. One thing I thought was super interesting, if people know the name of Brackett Park in Minneapolis, and there might be other things named after George Brackett. He was the city's 6th mayor. He was on the park board, just kind of like a civic leader. He is sort of the benefactor of this scrappy trio of guys doing this paper.
Yes. And one of the publishers said, this was Clarence French, said, when we struck a hard place, Mr. Brackett was pretty sure to come around with some remark like, Well, boys, how are you getting along? And if we were in straits, he helped out when he could with a little of the needed cash.
So on the Tribune side, we've got the city's first mayor, and then on the Journal side, we've got the sixth mayor, who's also this sort of civic leader. I just think it's so interesting that these people who are like founders of the city, essentially, are also supporting what becomes this newspaper. There's no question there. That was just a comment. Okay, so the Journal, we mentioned that it had sort of a bit of a, it's a tough start. And then they have this fire, like, right after they started.
Yes, their printing press burns down in 1880. The Tribune as well lost their buildings 2 times in fires, but did not miss printing an issue.
Can you imagine? And I can't believe that they bounced back from that. Okay, so we're going to talk in a second about Newspaper Row, which is sort of like around the turn of the century. But before we do that, we're going to talk about the founding of the Star, the Minnesota Daily Star first. It became the Minneapolis Star. Let's talk about the Minnesota Daily Star, because I think this is a fascinating history. 1920? What year are we in now?
Yeah, 1920.
Okay, we just skipped like 40 years, but we're going to go back. So, okay, what's happening in 1920?
So in 1920, the Minnesota Daily Star is born, and this paper is definitely not Republican. It was founded as a labor newspaper, collectively owned by its 20,000 stockholders, and it promised on its masthead to be published not for profit, but to promote the general welfare. And there also was a former mayor involved, but it was Minneapolis's one-term socialist mayor, Thomas Van Leer, who was the founding vice president of the paper.
Okay, and then who's the president?
And the president was someone named Herbert Gaston, and he's a journalist with ties to the Nonpartisan League, which, if you're not familiar, was a radical farmers alliance that called for state-run mills and grain elevators.
Okay, so just to recap, we've got the 2 Republican papers, and then we have this, I don't know if we can call it a literally socialist paper, but it's certainly a far left-leaning paper. Very different papers.
Yes. No, okay. I think it was Labor Party.
The Labor Party paper. Yeah. Okay. So, and I didn't put this in the notes, but I mean, what's sort of the vibe of the Star? What are they talking about? What are they publishing about? What are the early? I mean, what's like the first issue focusing on?
Yeah, so I read that first issue as well, and the main headline above the fold was "Workers Put Ban on Loop," all about organized labor boycotting a downtown theater over some labor issues.
Okay. And so ultimately a boycott, though, kind of wipes out this operation.
Yes. Then city business owners and merchants end up boycotting the Star. It struggles through that and makes it through, but then goes bankrupt a few years later, and it is reborn under new owners as the Minneapolis Daily Star, politically independent and with more of just a local focus on the city of Minneapolis.
Okay. All right. So those are the 3 papers. I mean, just to be honest, we are the culmination of even more papers than that, right? Like the Times would be in there too, and some others, right?
We were we kind of shared owners with some of these other papers, but
okay.
Those are the 3
These
that
are the 3 big ones.
Rolled into each other. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk about Newspaper Row. Does anybody here remember Newspaper Row or know about Newspaper Row? It's okay. It's fine. Okay, well, Newspaper Row was on 4th Street between Nicollet and Marquette.
Yes.
And this is like where all the newspapers are clustered. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to work there, but we're going to explain it to you because we have some great anecdotes about it. So tell us a little bit about Newspaper Row, Erica.
Well, so all of the
when are we? When is this?
Starting right around the turn of the century, 1900, some of the first newspapers moved there, and the folks who work there have sort of a romance about the place and describe the glamour. There were stage stars who would be at the opera down the street, and they would all gather together at I'm trying to think of the name of the
Sheiks?
bar of Sheiks. Yes,
yeah.
at Sheiks, and They were battling it out for scoops. One of the former editors of the Tribune wrote, in the noon hour, the block was literally jammed with printers, reporters, pressmen, stereotypers, engravers, mailers, an organized, inky confraternity like the trade guilds of old.
Stereotypers. I wonder what that means. We're going to have to look that up later.
We do need to look it up.
Okay, and then there's another quote here I thought was fun, and this is from a paper that was written in 1967 talking about Newspaper Row. It says, the reporters fought each other for the news. The editors cursed each other in the columns. The Teamsters yelled and swung at each other for parking space in the alley in back of the building. Minneapolis journalism was a lusty, swinging experience. Love it. So Newspaper Row sounds like a lot of fun. Nowadays, we work in a skyscraper, and it's fairly quiet by comparison.
There are cubicles.
Yeah, right. And so who are some of the, there's some interesting characters around this area.
Right. I enjoyed reading about the Tribune reporter Lorena Hickok, who's described as a pipe-smoking girl reporter in Morrison's book, and she covered both Gopher football games and murder trials very well, apparently. And also a husband and wife team, Delos and Maud Lovelace. So he was a night reporter, and she worked in features, and she's famous for the Betsy Tacy books.
What are those? Should I know what those are? We got a woo, so somebody knows what Betsy Tacy books are.
Yes,
are they big? Is that like Nancy Drew or like?
No.
Okay.
But kids' books.
Oh,
yes,
kids' books.
Yes.
It's not a mystery. Okay. And then there's an interesting Tribune publisher. This is going to lead us into some things about printing, but Fred Murphy, he becomes Tribune publisher in 1921, started in the press room. And what do we know about the press room?
Okay.
What was Fred Murphy going through as a young
Yeah,
man?
and it's interesting because he rose to be publisher, but he started as an apprentice. And our friend, the former editor Dylan, who has a very florid writing style, I would say, but here's how he described the press room. It is hard and exacting work in which one breathes an atmosphere saturated with ink, thrown off in microscopic globules from the spinning rollers and cylinders. The pores of the skin are filled with ink, and soap and water are without avail. Hair and eyelashes are black with the mixture of carbon and oil.
Wow. I remember in our old building, the main sort of men's showers, which I never used, but they were in the basement. It was the old pressman's showers, and you can kind of get a sense of why you need to have showers for these guys. I mean, Jesus, that is rough. I bet they didn't have showers in the Newspaper Row buildings.
Doubt it.
Okay, so then we're getting into a little bit more modern history. The Coles family buys the Star in 1935. This begins the consolidation process.
Yes, they were a newspaper family from Des Moines, Iowa, and they came into town and bought the Star, and then just 4 years later, they bought the Journal and combined the two. So it was the Star Journal for a time.
And they operated out of a building on Portland Avenue, which some may remember. This building was later renovated, we're going to get to that. Okay, so the Star Journal building was on Portland Avenue. It actually had a big sign and all that stuff. And then the Coles people didn't stop there.
They did not stop there. They took the circulation climbing for the Star Journal, and then they merged with the Tribune in 1941.
And then they renovated the building at 425 Portland?
Yes, and everybody left Newspaper Row.
Oh, okay. And that was the building that when I first came to the paper, worked at, and it was very cool. One anecdote I have about this that, it's just kind of funny to me. I inherited, within our office, a chamber pot that the newspaper guild had created. It's from 1947. It's sort of blue enamel, and it says, "To John Coles for doing a job," which seems to imply that they were mad that he had consolidated all of these newspapers into one. And this chamber pot lives at my desk. I will pass it on to the next person, and I'm honored that I hold the chamber pot now.
Fun fact.
Fun fact. Okay, so the Coles family now 41. So then what happens? So the Journal doesn't exist anymore.
The Journal
they merged.
and
They
the
just dropped
Star
the name.
merge, and then after a while, readers say that Star Journal is too confusing a name. It just becomes the Star. But the family does decide to keep both the Tribune and the Star running as separate papers, separate newsrooms, but one was published in the morning while the other was in the evening.
And this sort of goes on for like many decades, like 4 decades. And actually, a colleague of mine would talk about how he would get to the paper. I think he was working for the Star, the afternoon paper, and if he was working on some story that the Tribune guy was also working on, they would kind of have to like fight over the clips, like the archived stuff to look through. Like they were really competing against each other, which would be kind of wild a bit to think about being in an office and competing against other people in the same office at a different newspaper. But the point is that they were different papers, very much so.
Yes, for decades, all the way until 1982.
Okay, and then it became what?
Then we became the Minneapolis Star and Tribune.
Okay.
And some readers do still call us the Star and Tribune.
Yeah, and I think I saw some people writing after we changed our name to the Minnesota Star Tribune saying that we had dropped Minneapolis from our name, but that actually happened like a couple of years. This happened in the 80s.
Yes, 1987, we became Star Tribune, newspaper of the Twin Cities.
Okay, and it was that year that we also opened up our printing plant in the North Loop, and which, if people know today, we call it Heritage, but that's where we print a lot of newspapers, not just the Star Tribune, not just the Minnesota Star Tribune.
And we do public tours, so you can visit.
Yeah, you can sign up for a tour. Okay, and then the sort of last chapter of all this is our current move. Where are we today?
We are in Capella Tower.
Okay. We moved there in 2015. And so I covered this whole debate, but our old building got demolished and is now the Commons Park in downtown in front of the Viking Stadium. And so you can, and if you're looking for the medallions that used to be on our old building, those are now located on the Wells Fargo buildings that are next to the old Star Tribune building, the ones that are kind of in downtown East next to the stadium. You can see all the old medallions there. Anyway, I have on here for questions. If anybody has questions, we would happily entertain some questions, although this is a risky move because there may be 0 questions. This may be cut from the podcast if no one volunteers a question. What did you find most? Well, we'll wait for questions. Think of one and then let us know. We'll put you on microphone too. Just don't make me regret putting on microphone. But anyway, what did you think was most interesting about working on this?
I loved reading those first 3 issues and just kind of getting a picture of what this place was like at those kind of like a snapshot in time. And I also was really surprised to learn about the partisan nature of all 3 beginnings and how then that changed and how it became so much more standard here in the U.S. for papers to be impartial.
And on that note, we skipped one step, which was that when the Coles family created this consolidated situation, they had a new sort of editorial approach. Do you want to mention that?
Yes. They were the ones who came in with the idea that the newspaper should be impartial, present 2 sides of any controversial issue, and keep a separation between the editorial page, which is sharing opinions, and the news sections of the paper.
Got it. Okay.
Which we continue today.
Right. And, it's worth pointing out the Coles media empire was massive. I mean, Harper's Magazine just shut down the other day, and that was once a holding of the Coles Media Company, in addition to the Des Moines Register and a bunch of different papers around the country, or papers and magazines and media and stuff. I'm sure they own TV stations or whatever. But, we were once part of a pretty big kind of public company. So yeah. Any questions? You don't have to have one, but otherwise we're going to wind things down here. I don't have a question.
I don't have a what was most striking to you in editing this and reading some of these histories?
So I'll say, I love all the sort of the details in here about what it's like to work in an old press room, what it's like to be a reporter in the 19th century. I thought that all of that was fascinating. What Newspaper Row was like on a day-to-day level, that like at noon, like the sort of diversity of people of different jobs that are out on the street. All of that was like something that we really worked to get that stuff, to find that, because it was sort of hidden all over the place, right? And then I also think it's significant that literally every one of the papers that created the Minnesota Star Tribune had pretty prominent, like the mayors of the early city involved, and then later Thomas Van Leer. But these sort of like political types are very involved in the founding of those papers.
Yes.
So it shows sort of how wrapped up we are with the sort of civic history of Minneapolis.
Very true.
That's my reaction. All right, any questions? It's okay. You don't have to have one. It's fine. Well, thank you all for coming out. Again, this is the Curious Minnesota podcast. And if you like conversations like this, even if you don't actually, you should listen to the Curious Minnesota podcast. It's just called Curious Minnesota. It's on all podcast apps. We mostly talk about history. It's all about reader questions. And we also have a column. This is actually, the column is our main thing, so we should actually promote that. When does the column appear, Erica?
The column appears online on Friday and in the newspaper on Sunday.
And what is this week's column? It's actually a state fair special.
Yes. If anyone remembers one of the weirdest traveling exhibitions that would come to the fair, it was a frozen whale. And we had a reader wondering what happened to the frozen whale. So if you are wondering what happened to little Irvy, check the Star Tribune for the answer.
And we also had a story that ran, I think it was yesterday or Monday, and it's about the origins of Fairchild and Fairborn. And Fairchild turns out to be a real person.
A real person.
Or based on a real,
Yes,
named after a real person.
A tribute to a real person.
Right. It's not a real gopher. But there was a man named Fairchild who came up, what was it? He came up with what?
Henry S. Fairchild. And he had the idea to have the fair permanently on these grounds.
Got it. And if you were here on Saturday, which you probably weren't here on Saturday, but on Saturday we were also here collecting questions from fairgoers and then asking people to vote on their favorite questions. So what were the winning questions, or just off the top of your head, what were some of the winners?
Yeah, the winning question was, what are some of Minnesota's weirdest laws and the stories behind them? We also had a question that is kind of a hypothetical. Who would win, Paul Bunyan and Babe versus Thor and Fenrir, which I volunteered to write, so we'll see.
Fenrir is a wolf.
Answer. Yeah, stay tuned.
And then number 2 was what happened at Camp Snoopy?
Yes.
Nostalgia.
Very popular.
A lot of nostalgia right there. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we're going to be doing podcast episodes and articles, more importantly, about all of those things in the coming weeks. So that's what we do here at Curious Minnesota. If you think of a great question for us, submit it online. You can see us at startribune.com/curious. If you go to startribune.com/curious, you can actually read all 5 years of Curious Minnesota right there.
If you read
I should be leading you into things.
If you read all 5 years all at once, you would have so many Minnesota facts at your fingertips you can't even imagine.
Right. Well, there's even a function on there where you can say read a random story, and it'll take you to a random Curious Minnesota story. So that's fun. Okay, that's it for today's show. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer, standing over there, for editing this podcast and taping it today. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you are enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.